My name is Narayanan. I am going to be your host for today for the second day of Elevate, which is a virtual conference for chain makers being initiated by Global Action Poverty, which we call as GAP. I'm based out of Mumbai. I've been part of GAP for the last couple of years, coaching primarily social change makers. And today we are going to have three very interesting and very diverse topics with a couple of them from India and one from UK. And all these topics are varied, and I would like each one of you to participate in it, be absolutely focused on the topics that are being discussed, because probably we may not be getting such opportunities again on such varied topics in one single day. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce to you what are the topics, and then who are these people. So the first topic, which will begin in the next few minutes, or few seconds rather, is on conscious leadership, integrating the feminine and masculine energies, which is by Rukmini Iyer. We will get to her introduction in a bit. And then we have it, the next one is, does your work matter? Using the monitoring and evaluation, that is M&E, to ensure cost-effective, impactful programs. That is by Vishnu Padmanabhan. That's from 6:40 to 7:15. And the final session of the webinar for today is by Mac McKenzie. He's from UK and he has an organization called Bridge, and he will be talking on legendary leadership lessons and leading the pack. This will be from roughly around 7:20 to 8 p.m., which will close the day on the webinars for today. Couple of ground rules. You will see a chat. You will see on your left-hand side bottom, there is a chat box which can be used for all your questions. Again, independently, depending upon if the presenters want to seek your questions on during the presentation, it's their call, but you always have the option of using the chat box to put across your questions, and towards the Q&A session, which will be towards the end of each of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to listen to some of the questions of yours and the responses from the respective speakers. So since we are starting, say, roughly around 5 to 7 minutes late, I would not take much time here. We go to the next slide, which is on the speaker for the first session. Rukmini, I think you have it in front of you. She is a leadership facilitator, and she has been working as an organizational transformational consultant, over 17 years of work across South Asia and Middle East. She runs her own firm in Mumbai, which is called Exult, and she also has a peace building platform, and I like the title of it, The Womb Tales. She is here to talk about conscious leadership, and I would request Rukmini to take over from here.
Thank you, Narayan. Okay, so while I wait for the presentation to load, hi everyone. I'm based here in Mumbai, and today I'm talking to you from my home. That's, I guess, one of the perks of working by yourself and being on your own. You get to stay at home, and usually people are coming back from work in peak hour traffic. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about the idea of conscious leadership. Now, my fascination personally with this subject is one, primarily because I work in the area of leadership development with my corporate clients, but also because there's always been this constant quest to marry two things. One, my spiritual journey, the quest to understand what consciousness is about, what the universe is all about, and look at how do I integrate that into my workspace. So this integration in many ways fascinated me and also committed me to the idea of conscious leadership. And along the way, I discovered that there is already a great community around the world that exists that's working on conscious leadership, and including spaces like GAP, who are also working to promote this idea in many ways around the world. So this presentation is going to be for roughly about 20 minutes, which is where I'll introduce the concept to you. I've tried to make it as simple as possible, and I've in a way put in a lot of concepts here, but I'm hoping that as we go along discussing it, it should be clarified by the end of the presentation. So I'll reserve about the first 15 to 20 minutes to present the concept to you, and then we could take up questions at the end. However, while I'm speaking, if there's anything that pops up in terms of a question or a need for clarification, please feel free to type it into the chat window, and I'll take over the answers towards the end of the presentation.
Rukmini, sorry to interrupt. Can
Yes.
you just take over as the presenter? There is a button on the top.
I have
just
done
click on
that.
that.
So now the button on the top says stop presenting. So I think it's taken
Oh,
over.
okay. So it's already you're already taking up.
Yes.
You can access it. Thank you. Sorry for that.
No problem. Okay, so as we begin, my invitation to you is to think about leadership not so much as a competency, but as a journey. So traditionally, management theories have spoken about various styles of leadership. We've spoken about it as a skill, as a competency that needs to be developed. And while that is very valid in its own sense, when I'm speaking of the consciousness aspect of leadership, it's not so much a skill that one can master and stay at a certain level, but it's a constant journey. So our leadership, when we talk of it from a consciousness perspective, our leadership evolves as we do, and therefore there's really no end to that journey. So what do we mean by conscious leadership and the journey around it? Is there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, all of us as leaders, and here when I say leader, it doesn't only mean leadership of an organization or an enterprise or a community for that matter, but it begins really with self-leadership. And once self-leadership is in place, then it flows to all areas of our lives quite seamlessly. So when we are speaking of leadership, there is of course an outer journey part of it, in the sense the part of leadership that the world around us witnesses. So the world witnesses the fact that we achieve certain tasks, we overcome hurdles along the way, we build relationships, we heal relationships that are not working so well sometimes. And in the process, we grow from being an innocent, naive person to being a leader, someone that is looked up to by people around us. Along the way, we certainly raise collective consciousness by the impact that we have on people. And when I say raise collective consciousness, it doesn't have to necessarily be through something really groundbreaking or earth-shattering. It could simply be through a simple conversation that we have with a friend or a colleague, and that can shift a lot for that person and for the world around us. And of course, I don't need to say this in the context of GAP particularly, all our endeavors are towards uplifting society around us. So in the outer sense of the journey, all of us as leaders are looking at how can we serve selflessly. On the other hand, there is a parallel inner journey that goes along the way. While we are doing all of these tasks in the outer world, we're also achieving inner growth. I've used the term overcoming neurosis there. So here when I say neurosis, I don't necessarily mean a mental ailment of any kind, but what I mean is the fact that all of us have our own blocks, our own conflicts. Sometimes we get stuck with certain styles of managing and leading, and that can, if not monitored and managed and chosen consciously, become dysfunctional. So when I say overcoming neurosis, it's about staying aware of what is the manner in which I lead and choose to lead in any moment. And am I doing it in a manner that is aware and out of choice, or am I doing it out of habit? So that's what I mean by overcoming neurosis. In the process, we heal internal schisms, internal conflicts that a lot of us may have. And these conflicts could vary from right from something as practical as how do I focus, or where do I focus my business goals towards, to a certain relationship, whether I hold it or release it, how do I deal with a certain colleague. It could be all varieties of conflicts within us which reflect in the world around us, in our enterprises as well. Along the way, one very important uh, step in the process of self-leadership is the transition from being the victim to the creator, from being a victim of my circumstances, from being in this helpless space, to saying, all right, this is my space, this is my world, and what do I do with it? How do I work with it and make it better? And I'm sure we have very exemplary examples amongst us here today as change makers in GAP as well. And in this process, we certainly, of course, evolve, we raise our own consciousness. So the inner journey is all about mastering oneself, overcoming our own inner blocks, and going along this journey. So it is this journey that I invite you into as we speak about conscious leadership. And as we go along, as I said, we're speaking about leadership as a journey and not so much as a certain style to adopt. So now coming to feminine leadership, and you will hear me use the term feminine leadership a lot in this presentation, and sometimes I may also use it as a synonym to conscious leadership. That does not mean that in any way the masculine aspect of leadership is any less important. Both are equally critical. It's just that to a great extent we are exposed to and educated into masculine leadership to an extent where we've also managed to create a world that is sometimes, and a lot of times in fact, hypermasculine. And that's where there is a crisis of consciousness at this point in time, in that we see businesses around us not really working very well. There is all around the world economic and political crisis, and we are in very many ways questioning leadership around the world. A lot of countries, including India, are questioning political leadership in a big way. And in this context, therefore, feminization of leadership is critical to restore the balance. Now, when I say feminine leadership or feminization of leadership, it is important to clarify here that we're not talking of feminine in the context of biological sex or gender, but inner energies. Psychologically, all of us have both the feminine and the masculine energies within us. Of course, we choose to exercise these energies in different proportions depending on, one, our social conditioning, and two, on how consciously we've chosen to cultivate each of these energies, and therefore what is it that we choose to exhibit, and what is the kind of balance that we choose to exhibit in. So when I say feminine leadership, therefore, it is as applicable to men as it is to women. So feminization of leadership is critical, one, from the diversity perspective, and a lot of research around the world is speaking about this, the fact that women are indeed good for business because they lend a different perspective, they lend a more holistic view to business from an economic sense, from the point of view of purpose, from the point of view of connecting with consumers and our target audience. And this inclusion is critical for sustainability of business. And of course, around the world, we're also seeing that women are rapidly taking or waking up in some sense and taking critical roles in business. If you look at the numbers, of course, there's still a lot left to be desired. However, I think the process is very much on track. So why is feminine leadership important? It is important because the traditional leadership model is no longer working as well as we'd like it to work. How did we get to the traditional model of leadership, and for that matter, a lot of management theories that some of us must have studied and are also practically using? Most of these leadership models have been derived from the war era, right? So they're designed for combat. So the idea of leadership and managing business is really about one, surviving, two, defeating the competitor, and therefore, because this is the base of the traditional leadership model, there is a sense of hierarchy that is needed to hold this model together. So therefore, most businesses, traditional businesses that we see around the world, have a very rigid organizational structure. There is a certain protocol that is needed to access the hierarchy up and down the line. And there is a need for standard procedures which cannot be broken, and you're penalized if you try and work around those procedures. And in the process, decision making gets impacted, communication gets impacted, and more often than not, relationships within an organization, within an enterprise, get impacted. So while the good things about this traditional leadership model, which is primarily a masculine model, is that there is a lot of discipline that gets enforced. There is compliance, which is critical from a quality perspective, from a perspective of making sure that things work on time and according to process. The flip side of it is that a lot of times we are asked to make sacrifices which may not necessarily make sense to us emotionally, psychologically, and in terms of aligning with our personal purpose and integrity. And very importantly, a lot of times in traditional leadership model, the belief is that the end justifies the means, and therefore we look to do anything and anything at all which can lead to profits, which can lead to survival. And when there is no purpose beyond profit, that's where an enterprise stops serving the community around us. And the community, of course, includes the consumers of the enterprise, but it also includes other stakeholders, including the employees, the community where the business or the enterprise is based, and of course the participants of the enterprise, which could be the owners and the shareholders and so on. Thankfully, our context is changing. So from a world which relied on order, which relied on centralization of authority and therefore hierarchical structures and power that is very closely held, we are moving, partly due to change in technology and of course also due to change in consciousness that's being brought about all over the world, we are moving into a space which is sometimes uncomfortably ambiguous, but that I guess is here to stay for a while. We are moving into a space where peer-to-peer networks are becoming more important than one central authority. All of us, of course, have very easy access to information given the availability of internet. Power is getting more and more distributed now, given that a lot of us have access to knowledge and information. Knowledge is no longer as prized a commodity in that its shelf life is zero, and plus the access of it is easy. And therefore structures in enterprises are moving from being hierarchical to being heterarchical, which means that there are several layers of leadership. And this is a huge area of possibility for all of us, regardless of whether we're leading an enterprise or we're part of somebody else's enterprise. All of us have an opportunity to lead, beginning with ourselves and then, of course, influence people around us. And therefore, the competencies which were appreciated in traditional leadership, which is about being the boss, being the organization, having power, is now moving, and we are appreciating more and more the role of being a catalyst, somebody who can be a change maker and make things happen. somebody who's a great collaborator and a connector, who can use relationships well in a manner that things get going not just for oneself but also for the community. And therefore, how do we inspire people to do this along with us? So leadership, therefore, is shifting from being in the spotlight, from being the hero, to facilitating more heroes. Behind the scenes, leadership is coming up in a big way. So I think this quote in many ways summarizes the crux of feminine leadership, which is that while most leadership models focus on what leaders do and some on how they do it, the key aspect is from where do we do it. So all of us as social entrepreneurs here, as coaches here, as mentors here, from what are we leading? Am I leading to serve? Am I leading for a purpose that is beyond my own gains, but also to benefit the world around me? What is my motivation to lead is, in a way, the base of feminine leadership. So let me get to the core of what feminine leadership is. So while there's a lot to say about this, I've tried to capture it in this one particular slide, and I will in the next few slides go on to elaborate very quickly on what each of these capacities mean. So feminine leadership is rooted in the idea of presence, and I will speak more about presence as we go along. And through presence, we continue to develop these three core capacities of wholeness, fluidity, and congruence. Wholeness is the idea, and all of these capacities start with the self. So as a feminine leader, as a conscious leader, it is important that we begin to integrate and develop these qualities within ourselves to start with, and then make sure that these qualities are also transitioned to our teams, to our organizations and enterprises that we lead. So wholeness is the idea of uniting all parts of oneself, and I'll speak a little more about that in just a bit. Fluidity, or another word for that could be flexibility, is about being prepared to deal with a world that is disruptive. We don't really know what technology will change things for us around tomorrow, and therefore how seamlessly can we switch from what is the reality today to what could come up tomorrow? Are we prepared for that degree of bending without breaking? And the third capacity is that of congruence, to be aligned with one's own purpose, to be centered internally as well as externally. Starting with presence. Now, presence in simple terms is a profound state of awareness. It's a state where consciousness flows both internally and externally around us. It's a state of being in constant and conscious contact with one's higher self, if I can use that term, while remaining in the flow with what is the reality around us. So the critical aspects of presence are, one, and this is a very ignored aspect of presence sometimes, that presence begins with our body. And why does it begin with our body is because amongst all the aspects that we have around us, we have, as if we were to consider ourselves as an asset, we have our physical body, we have emotions, we have our mental capabilities, and so on. Among all of these aspects of self, it's the body which is capable of only and only remaining in the present. Our mind can wander. My mind, even as I speak to you now, could probably wander around and think about the future. It could think about the past. Our emotions could also wander. For example, even as I'm speaking to you, I may perhaps be angry about, let's say, something that happened in the morning, or I may be happy about something that happened yesterday. But the body is only true to the present. So as I'm sitting here speaking to you, I am only here and not anywhere else. And therefore, the key to presence is connecting with the body and then monitoring our breath. And when I say monitoring our breath, it doesn't necessarily mean changing it or breathing in in a particular manner, simply being aware of it and trying to be as relaxed, as comfortable as possible. Along the way, look at what practices can we inculcate to clear our minds. And when I say clear our minds, it's not so much about emptying completely of the thoughts, but being in a state of awareness about what the thought is, what emotions are welling up, but at the same time being okay with it, being not hassled by it. In the process, as we become calmer, we also open up to what is the world around us, what's our reality like, without judging it. And along the way, we start developing what is termed as a sensitive sonar, a sensitive, let me put it in a simpler way, a very heightened use of all our senses, our eyes, ears, nose, all our sensory organs. How much information can we pick up from the reality around us? Right? That's a sensitive sonar. And our senses get heightened when we are in a relaxed space, when we are in a space of clear mind, where we are willing to look at what is our reality. We are willing to listen. We are willing to see things around us without judgment. So there are several practices that can help us enhance presence as leaders. Meditation works for some of us, going for a walk, painting, music. There are all kinds of presence practices that one can follow. But my urge to you as leaders would be to look at how regularly can you inculcate any presence practice in your routine on a day-to-day basis, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's listening to music, whether it's simply meditating in some form, perhaps doing some kind of breath work. Whatever that practice is, it's important as a leader to invest in this practice for a few minutes every day to enhance our sensitive sonar. So that's the key to feminine leadership, because the feminine aspect of ourselves starts from the body. It flows from there, the consciousness. Now coming quickly to wholeness and the other two competencies. Wholeness, and there's a lot that can be said about this. By wholeness, what we mean is, are we aware of the fact that there are several parts to us? There is an inner child, there is an inner parent, there's the inner feminine and the masculine. And are we aware of the fact that all of these parts are talking to us, are alive in us at any given point in time? And how integrated are we? How aware are we of all of these parts? There are several ways in which to work at wholeness. One is to look at, one is to explore what is called the idea of internal family systems. I'll type that out for your reference. And there are several articles and videos available online on internal family systems, which help us in working through this. And I'd recommend that you look up some of these resources to see how can you work to make sure that you feel more whole. All parts of you, including our own critic, our own appreciator, the part of us that is scared, the part of us that is enthusiastic. How can we address and speak to all of these parts as a leader and not ignore any of them, so that we are very aware of what Carl Jung would, in psychological terms, call the persona, right? So we know more and more aspect of ourselves. That's the idea of wholeness. The second capability or capacity to develop for conscious leadership is the idea of fluidity. Now, what you see here on the screen is what I've borrowed from the polarity mapping model of Dr. Barry Johnson. So the idea of polarity is that a lot of times, because of our conditioning, we are taught to believe in extremes. Even if we look at the world around us, we look at extremes like material life is better than spiritual life, or vice versa. Long-term orientation is better than short-term, or being individualistic is more important than being socially oriented. The idea of right and wrong, good and bad, that's the idea of polarity. But the world is now calling for that move from being polarized to embracing a paradox, moving to a space where we speak not of either or, but of saying both and, choosing between things to co-holding space for multiple things. And why is this important is because overdoing one pole, for example, overdoing the feminine pole, if you're being only a feminine leader and not a masculine leader, that can be counterproductive as well. So if you look at the top left-hand corner of this diagram on the screen, I've spoken of the gifts of the feminine. If we embrace the feminine aspect of our leadership, what is it that we bring to the table? We bring in a lot of empathy, we bring in gentleness, inclusion, we can be nurturing, there's a lot of openness, we trust, and we appreciate vulnerability in self and, of course, in our organizations. However, if we stay at that pole, then we slip down, right? Because we stop being conscious of it. When the femininity of leadership becomes unconscious, it becomes a mindless habit, then the femininity can turn from being useful to being sentimental. So from being empathetic, we become sentimental, we become needy. We can be clingy and therefore dependent, and in the process our leadership can become really irrational sometimes and unfocused. We move away from our goals. On the other pole, if you look at the gifts of the masculine on the right hand side, the masculine brings us a lot of clarity. Our own masculine leadership, our energies bring us clarity. There's assertiveness, focus, a sense of direction. We know what our goals are. We know how to structure our activities towards our goals. But if we overdo it, and in very many ways we've overdone this as a world, we become aggressive. There's competition which is ruthless. We can be aggressive to the point of being cruel sometimes and insensitive. And in the process, there can be a lot of emotional and sometimes physical violence. So from a space of embracing our own power and believing our own inner power, we become power hungry, and therefore, and this is something that a lot of our political leadership around the world is already reflecting. So the idea of fluidity is to be able to dance between the top two conscious poles, right? To dance between the gifts of the feminine and the gifts of the masculine, and not slip down to the unconscious feminine and the unconscious masculine, which can be dysfunctional. So that's the idea of fluidity. And how do we do this? We do this by being mindfully aware of which of these traits do we normally tend to exhibit, and are these unconscious, are these conscious, and how do we want to shift? So one way to look at this is you could perhaps draw up your own chart which looks similar to this and captures these four poles, and look at how does your feminine and your masculine play out when you're aware of it and when you're unaware of it. So the unconscious piece could be something that comes to you as a feedback from people around you, your friends, family, and colleagues. And that's an exercise that I find well worth doing from time to time as a leader. And the final capacity that we're speaking about is congruence. Right? And congruence is it's the capacity to be centered, to be authentic, and of course to align being and doing, to align ourselves with our purpose and act in a way that makes sure that our purpose is getting reflected. There are very many ways to find our purpose. I'm sure a lot of us find it intuitively. Some of us may find it through various tools. For example, what you see on the screen is based on this tool called the Enneagram, which you can also look up online. That's the word that I'm typing in, Enneagram. There's a lot of material again online that you can access. And the Enneagram speaks of finding the purpose through these 9 types that are listed there. Right? For example, I'm the kind of a person that lives for something that's beyond me, or my core value is that of nurturing myself and others, or my core value is of renewal, of creativity, and so on. So each of us can find our purpose in different ways. Sometimes we find our purpose in conversation with a friend, or perhaps in the context of GAP, we can also find it in conversation with our coaches here. We can find our purpose simply by intuiting it. We can find it sometimes in the process of working on the field. Sometimes tests like the Enneagram also help us in finding what our purpose is. And then, very importantly, once we've found it, it's very important that we align our work, our physical task, our outer journey of leadership to this purpose, and make sure that the inner and the outer journey is in a way supporting each other and not being different from each other. So that's those are the three capacities of feminine leadership: wholeness, fluidity, and congruence. So an exercise that I would invite you to do later today, when you have time, is to spend a few quick moments outlining and answering these questions for yourself. One is, what's my presence like? How do I cultivate it? What are the practices that I choose to do on a regular basis to cultivate it? How much can I invest in improving and strengthening my presence? The second piece is my power. What do I consider is my power? And I've brought in the word power because in many ways the idea of feminine leadership, the idea of consciousness, is rooted in personal power. So how much do I honor and acknowledge my personal power, my ability to lead myself and to change things for the world around me? And how do I choose to exercise it? Is there more that I can do beyond what I'm already doing? Third one, and an important one at that, is, what's my pleasure? What do I enjoy doing? So while all of these aspects of consciousness and leadership sounds very serious, it's important also to celebrate ourselves as we are doing it. So an important question to ask ourselves is, how do I celebrate myself, my capacities, my achievements, the people around me? How do I make sure that I celebrate every day? And the celebration could simply be about sometimes giving myself the permission to take a nap in the middle of the day if necessary, or to read a book, or perhaps go out with my family, have an appreciative conversation with someone. How is it that I very consciously celebrate myself and the world around me? And lastly, of course, am I clear of my purpose? And how do I live it? How do I intend to continue to live it as I go along? So these are 4 questions that I'll encourage you to answer when you have time for yourself today. So that's that from me on conscious leadership. I'll be happy to take any questions from you if you have any. And you can, of course, also mail me at any point in time on the mail ID that's listed on the screen. And yeah, I'll be happy to take it on from there.
Thank you very much, Rukmini. Thanks for a very interesting topic, very intriguing topic. And if there are any questions, we would be happy to post it to Rukmini. And as I was pointing out earlier, also we could just put it on the chat, or if you are online, you can ask Rukmini directly now. We just have a couple of minutes because the next speaker is already in. So we would like you to consider the paucity of the time. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question that I read. How do we cultivate the characteristics in the conscious part? Can it be cultivated by showing more of it? Yes, Vaishnavi. How do we cultivate it is my suggestion would be to begin with presence, because I think that's the key. That's where it all begins. So if we can devote even 5 to 10 minutes of our day, and any time at all during the day, to invest in some form of presence practice, right, where we are by ourselves and doing something that brings us into acute awareness of the body to begin with, and then of our breath, and then becoming aware of what are the thoughts, emotions going on in our mind, simply being observant of it without feeling the need to respond or react to it. and then moving our awareness from that space, from that relaxed space, to simply starting to hear, simply starting to see things around us, noticing the colors in the room around us, or if you're in a garden or someplace, looking at textures, smells, spaces around us. Developing that presence in a way is the first step to consciousness. And once we start doing that on a day to day basis, then it's a matter of enhancing awareness towards the other three capacities, the idea of wholeness and flexibility and congruence. Those are things that we can start building in a more aware manner. We can even start building them as competencies or skills, if you choose to use that term. Wholeness, for example, can be built in very easily by working with parts of us, right? Inner parts. So a tool like internal family system is a great tool to work on wholeness. The idea of polarity mapping that I earlier shared is a great way to start working on fluidity. Practice mapping polarities on a regular basis. Similarly, the idea of congruence could be done through goal setting on a regular basis and reviewing our goals. So yes, there is consistent effort that is needed to become more conscious, and very importantly, there's really no end to this journey. It goes on till the time we are alive.
Good. Thank you for that. Okay, so there is another question on any reference books, media to know more on this leadership concept.
Yes, thank you for that question, Sachin. I'm typing in names of two specific books that I would certainly recommend. One is called Shakti Leadership by Nilima Bhatt and Raj Sisodia, and the other is Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey and Raj Sisodia again. Yeah, so both of these are, I find, great books which speak to both of these ideas, the idea of consciousness and the concept of feminine leadership.
Okay, thank you. So Sachin, considering the paucity of time, what I would request you to do on that question of case studies is write to Rukmini separately and seek out what kind of case studies where this can be applied. I'm really sorry, we cannot push longer because the next guest is here, and yeah, thank you very much, Sachin, for considering that. So thank you very much, Rukmini, for this session. And I mean, there would be people, I think they would be seeking out more information from you, more on a one-on-one separately. Yeah?
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fine. So we move on to the next